medical doctor with many, many years of experience dealing with patients in the community and hospital. He has a lot of experience with patients who are abusing substances. So Dr. Peterson, welcome again, and we look forward to what you have to tell us this evening. So the purpose of the workshop this evening is to understand the importance of change in behavior in substance misuse, as well as to increase knowledge and or heighten awareness surrounding readiness for change and how to support someone during their recovery journey. So Recovery 101. What is recovery? Well, one definition of recovery is that recovery from a substance use disorder is defined as a process of improved physical, psychological, and social well-being and health after having suffered from a substance-related condition. So Dr. Peterson, we have been studying the brain. You have really told us a lot about the brain, and I know that the brain has a lot to do with addictions. So I'm guessing that the brain will also have a lot to do in our recovery process. Can you please expound on that a little more?
It does. Addiction has been defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease. Addiction has also been defined as a disease, it's not really a moral failing. And addiction can also be looked at as a result of a multitude of neuroplastic changes in the brain. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. So neuroplastic, what actually does that mean? It sounds very complicated.
Neuroplasticity, everyone has neuroplasticity. We were born with from birth. We develop neuroplasticity over the term of our life. But neuroplasticity is simply the ability of the brain to change its physical structure and function based on life experiences and repeated behaviors, emotions, and thoughts. So it actually centers right in our brain. And we know also that addiction recovery is related to neuroplasticity. One of the things we have to be happy about is addiction is the result of neuroplasticity, and also recovery from drug addiction is also the result of neuroplasticity, because neuroplasticity is actually what one does habitually, whether it's good or bad, and it literally the brain literally gets wired into the structure. The habits or practices are literally wired into the structure of the brain. Neuroplasticity is also the basis of all of our learning, and it makes the brain incredibly resilient, enabling people to recover from injuries and birth abnormalities. Neuroplasticity also improves neurological deficits. You can pull out a psychological condition and reverse behavioral patterns, and that's exactly what neuroplasticity does in the case of a person being addicted from substance abuse or drugs. And to me, that's a bright light at the tunnel. So that means that there's hope and the sun will shine again. There is hope that the sun will shine again, even in the life of a person who has been addicted to opioids or some type of habitual practice or behavior.
Okay, so you're saying that the same pathways, the same ways that people became addicted to drugs, smoking, cigarettes, are the same pathways that this person can use to recover.
That's absolutely true. As a matter of fact, we know that in the formation or in our brain, the central part of the brain, we have a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is a chemical messenger that actually carries signals across the synapses and that are responsible for motivation and reward seeking in our minds. And it's essential for neuroplastic change to take place. And so we actually depend on dopamine for neuroplasticity to develop, whether it's for developing a bad habit or a good habit. Addiction to the brain's reward system addiction is just simply the brain's reward system gone awry. In other words, there's a disruption in the normal functioning of the brain's reward system. And the brain is a highly skilled reward detector. An addicted brain has learned to prioritize and seek rewards above all else. You can look at the addiction this way: is compulsive, repetitive, getting a reward despite the damaging consequences. And that's actually what happens in the case of addiction. But recovery can actually reduce that process. One of the things we have to keep in mind is it actually depends on how long a person's been addicted to a substance and whether or not, and what that particular substance is. But there is a possibility for recovery. One of the challenges we're facing today is the fact that fentanyl and oxycodone and a number of other different oxycontin and number other addicting substances are not only produced by legal pharmaceutical companies, but now you have a lot of people who are actually not trained in the field of pharmacology actually producing these substances because there's a lot of money to be made. And so they actually produce some of these substances, and some of them are not quite as capable of doing what the pharmaceutical companies have designed them to do. But we have to keep in mind also that any drug or all drugs have secondary effects, side effects. And so it depends on a number of factors as to how soon a person can come back from recover from addiction. And in some cases, it may even take years for that to actually happen.
So depending on the years of the abuse, the outcome can be either good, bad, or maybe even fatal. Is there a point of no return for some people?
Yes, there is a point of return, and about recovery in that situation, we're talking about a situation where a person actually overdoses. And you've heard of so many people. In fact, just this afternoon, I was listening to a report given by Health in the media, and just the statistics from last year alone, more than 90,000 people in this country died from overdose of drugs, or opioid related drugs, or opioid addiction, or drug related addictions. Over 90,000 people in this country alone last year, 2020, died from those kinds of problems. So it is a very significant problem in our communities. It's a severe, serious public health problem. We know that addiction continues long after the last dose of a drug, and sometimes can last for years. Now, this was demonstrated in animal studies first, and then we were able to do some studies on humans, and it showed the same thing, that a person can actually start the recovery process. But even though they have stopped taking addicting substances, it might actually take years for them to actually recover from the use of that particular substance. It's now understood that the drug addiction is a learned behavior. In other words, it's a learned behavior because what happens in the brain's reward system is that the more often a reward a reward is given in the brain, or dopamine is secreted in the brain from a pleasurable or excited activity, the deeper the impression. You probably heard that term before. Repeating something over and over deepens the impression. Well, it's the exact same thing that happens when a person is taking an addictive substance or practicing an addictive behavior. So both of those things are happening. So we have to, since it's a learned behavior, one of the good things about neuroplasticity is that behavior can be unlearned.
So how can the behavior be unlearned?
That behavior can be unlearned by removing the substance, or the behavior, or whatever is causing the behavior in the individual, or the actions. In fact, we actually have about 3 clinical processes to aid in recovery. One of the main things we're going to look at is the fact that addiction is a memory trace that exhibits itself by reflex activities of the brain circuits. And that brain circuit we're talking about is the brain reward pathway, especially the reward system, resulting in motivation to resume drug-taking behavior when drug-related cues or triggers are encountered. Because neuroplasticity is basically reversible, it's reversible. So if you undo or untrain or unlearn a habit, it actually is a process, is one of the earliest steps from recovering from an addiction. So what is learned can be unlearned, as the brain can make changes to support new or health.
Okay, so I have a question regarding once the brain unlearns the behavior, what about the body? Because I know when, for instance, like let's talk about smoking.
Mhm.
Smoking is a very you know, people get addicted to smoking very quickly
Very
because
addictive. Yes, very much
from
so.
what yeah, from what I understand, because of the nicotine and certain things that are in the cigarette. So what happens to those sediments and things in the body when a person stops smoking? Does that
Well,
make
there's several things that actually happen. We know that some of the signs and symptoms of a person who may be addicted, but there are also some physiological changes that actually takes. One of the things we have to keep in mind about addictions, particularly if it's a chemical addiction, as in the case of substance abuse or opioid use or opioid abuse or misuse, and chemical changes, biological changes actually take place in the brain and other parts of the body. Sometimes those things cannot be reversed. Okay. So what we can do is go back and start working with the brain reward pathway. So in the case of a person, let me give you a good example of, in the case of a person who is addicted to tobacco or cigarettes, is just one of the things that nicotine affects is the hypothalamus in the brain. Now, we know the hypothalamus is a part of the brain that regulates body temperature, it regulates the appetite, it regulates a number of other different functions in the body. Once you start smoking and you become addicted to smoking, it actually causes some serious problems, because if you try to stop smoking, if you start smoking, you smoke for any period of time, it's going to cause you to put on weight after you stop smoking. Now, some people actually gain weight while they're smoking. But if you stop smoking, what it does is stimulates the appetite, which is centered in the hypothalamus. And therefore, many people start eating more and more and more and more frequently, and they eat also larger quantities of food. Other things, they may have problems with the regulation of body temperature, because hypothalamus is also responsible for regulating body temperature internally and externally. So they have some problems. Maybe why not? You might be right now. We're in the middle of the summer. They may have some problems with chills, and while everyone else is experiencing heat, they may be experiencing chills. So we see some differentiations taking place there. Another thing to keep in mind about nicotine is the fact that nicotine actually hijacks the brain. It hijacks parts of the brain, and it gives us a psychological high or a sense of euphoria. And this is why you see many people who are addicted to tobacco have to go on what we call become chain smokers. Every 15 to 20 minutes, and usually no longer than about a half hour, they have to go doing household chores or whatever they do and take a cigarette. Some people smoke as they do their work. So that's those are some of the habits of addicting. The other thing too is tobacco has some effects up on many of the organs and tissues in the body. It elevates blood pressure. It causes problems with the lungs. In fact, anybody who smokes for about 10 years or more, probably, even if they don't come up with lung cancer, are more likely to come up with a condition we call a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Now, COPD is a very serious problem because it's once you get it, it's irreversible. There are several different types of COPD, okay? But it's once you get it from smoking or something like that, it's usually irreversible. So the best thing you can do is get some what we call palliative treatment or palliative support. Oxygen. You see little people walking, or some people walking around who have COPD have a little tank that they're carrying around, trailing behind. Now there are portable tanks, oxygen tanks you can get, and you see them carrying on the shoulder or whatever. But those are some of the side effects. There are a number of others we could actually list at this particular point, but that's just to give you an example that sometimes even though we may able to be able to reverse some of the processes that actually take place in the central nervous system, some of the other physiological damage that are done to certain organs and tissues cannot be reversed.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Peterson, you mentioned earlier about the some pathways
Mm-hmm.
to recovery, and I know that you mentioned there are three of them. They're clinical, non-clinical, and self-management. Which self-management is kind of interesting, but can you expound a little bit more about the clinical, like the
Yeah,
pharmacology and the
yes, I can.
12-step programs? Mm-hmm.
The clinical component usually has to do with using a pharmacology substance, another chemical substance, to actually help the person in the process of stopping using opioids or some other addictive substance. In the case of opioids, we use what is called naloxone, and that's one drug. We also use buprenorphine. Those are two of the most prominent drugs we actually use, or pharmacological agents we use to help stop that process. And one of the things that happens with some people who, for instance, if we also use buprenorphine as a good, let me show you explain to you what happens when a person takes alcohol, for instance. If a person is addicted to alcohol and they're taking buprenorphine or some other related product, whenever they take that product, even if they're on a recovery process, it will cause them to vomit. They're not supposed to be drinking alcohol, not supposed to be taking tobacco. And so when they use that product, if they're taking the buprenorphine or some other related product we use, chemical product that we use to reverse the process of addiction, it causes nausea, vomiting. In other words, the chemical centers in the brain that causes vomiting become active, and it nauseates the person. And they feel that once they start trying to smoke cigarette or drink alcohol, they feel so nauseous, they have to kick it out. Or if they don't, they'll vomit it back out. Those are some processes. But also involved is a 12-step facilitation program. This is a program that's been in use for a good number of years. It's similar to the Alcohol Anonymous program, except that there are 12 steps. And the basic premise behind it is pretty much the same. The next is the cognitive behavioral therapy, which we actually talked about a couple of weeks ago. And that's a process where there's 6 steps that a person or individual who is addicted to a substance or a behavior has to go. And they go through, first they start off in deciding whether or not they want to make the change. And once they make that decision, they enter into a process or an agreement with themselves, first of all, get a support system, and they go through it, and individuals who are supporting them and help working with them to overcome this problem. Another one is a relapse prevention program. Relapse is as normal as taking the drug itself, because anytime you start a process that supposedly reverses another process that you've been habitually involved in for a significant period of time, you're gonna fall off the wagon. And when you fall off the wagon, generally, what you don't do, the one thing you don't want to do in a relapse prevention program is you want to continue on. You want to continue on the process. Okay. The next one is what we call the recovery process. Next one deals with the non-clinical, and the non-clinical process is a process that actually non-clinical process actually is a situation where we actually use a person goes to a facility where he or she is actually given the opportunity to go through a non-addiction program. It's a recovery residence and a peer-based recovery support system. It's a place where you have professionals who are trained in the field of this particular field, usually in psychology, behavioral science, whatever. And some are faith-based recovery support systems. Others are educational-based recovery system services that are actually offered. Some are community-based. Some are run by public or private clinics. Some are run by governmental agencies and on these kinds of things. That is non-clinical. But in the last one is what we call a self-supported. That's self-management. Self-managed is a natural way. A person actually just goes what we call cold turkey. They just stop using the drug on their own, and they depend on support from others, encouragement from others. And willpower is important, and they make a decision that they want to stop using these drugs, and they use that as a premise to keep moving forward. Now, it doesn't always, willpower is not as strong as we think it is. This is why sometimes we actually have to keep in mind we need some assistance from some other individuals, a good support system that's going to help carry us through the actually recovery process.
Dr. Peterson,
Uh-huh.
can I
Yes.
go back to the clinical
Yeah.
the clinical pathway? So
Yes.
I think you said the pharmacology where the person who's addicted will take another drug
Yes.
to replace the one that they're addicted to. Is that correct?
Yeah,
What is
it does.
what
And
is the difference?
let me explain a little difference. For instance, naloxone. Naloxone is a chemical substance that actually blocks the effect of opioids. Okay, and so therefore, it's used. Excuse me. It's used oftentimes for that very purpose. So, naloxone can actually, if a person is in the process of overdosing, for instance, if you get to them in time, you can give them naloxone. Naloxone will block the effects and the receptors in the cell that opioids affect, because opioids, like most drugs that are addictive like this, have effects in the different parts of the body. For instance, opioids have a very serious effect on the respiratory tract. They also have a very serious effect on the cardiac system. In the respiratory system, it slows down breathing. And many times when people die from overdoses of opioids, it's because the breathing has become so shallow that they're not getting sufficient amounts of oxygen, and there may be a buildup of carbon dioxide inside the lungs. And that actually may contribute to them succumbing to an opioid overdose. So the heart rate goes down very low to the point where it can't support life. Oxygen is insufficient. And so that's just one of the examples. Buprenorphine it works in a similar way, but it's a little bit more specific than naloxone in that it actually not only blocks the receptors for the opioids, but it actually can help support the respiratory system and the cardiac system in a way, and helps the person overcome in that way. There are other drugs. There are several other new drugs that have come on the market recently, and they have similar effects as naloxone and also buprenorphine.
Okay, thank you. There is a question in the chat. Someone is asking, is Narcan used only for overdose? Is it ever prescribed as a medical treatment for addiction? And is there a pill form?
It is a pill form. I'll answer your last question first. It is a pill form, and usually it is not used specifically for recovery alone. It's usually used to block the effects. Emergencies used basically for emergencies when a person has actually in the actual process of overdosing from the use of opioid or some other drug like that. But there is another drug that's similar to naloxone. It's belongs to the same chemical family of naloxone, that has been used to treat. And that particular drug, the name actually escapes me. It has a name similar to naloxone or Narcan, but it actually is used and prescribed in the very treatment of opioid recovery and substance abuse.
Okay, thank you. I have a question regarding self-management. In your experience and over the years, you've dealt with many people who are addicted to many different things. In your experience, self-management, natural recovery, willpower, cold turkey, how many people have you actually known that's the pathway that they choose to recover?
Well,
or their pathway to sobriety?
to answer that question, I'd have to go back and look at the particular addictive substance or behavior that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
most times you will find that going cold turkey is extremely difficult. It's difficult because willpower is not as strong as we think it is. And also natural recovery. Some of the side effects, a person could actually start vomiting.
Mm.
Let me give you another. Let me give an example in the case that you probably may be more familiar with. In a person who's addicted to alcohol, if a person is addicted to alcohol, and if they going into what a condition we call DDTs, and that is delirium tremens. In that situation, they're going through a process of recovery, but it's also a process in which the body has become so dependent on alcohol that it affects the psychosis in the brain. And the person develops a psychosis in the brain. That their short-term memory is gone. The body temperature elevates. There's so many other factors that actually take place. The respiration is very slow, and they have to breathe hard and whatever. And actually, if they have a deficiency in the B complex vitamins, which are like you may have heard of thiamine. You have to give that person thiamine. And if the person doesn't know the actual steps that they have to go through, if they're trying to uh, go through recovery from alcohol abuse, they actually may wind up dying. And this is what happens. Let me give you another example that's related to the same thing. If a police officer stops an individual on the highway or the road and gives them a DUI ticket, that is driving under the influence of alcohol, if they suspect that that individual or individuals, if it's more than one, is an alcoholic, if they take that individual to jail rather than taking them to the hospital, they can actually be held legally for responsibility of what happens to that individual. Why? Because that person goes through certain steps and changes from delirium tremens, from a withdrawal from alcohol. And therefore that person doesn't need to go to jail at that time. If they need, even if they need to be in jail, they need to go to the hospital or go to a treatment center where they can actually get the proper treatment that they need to keep them from succumbing to the use of withdrawal symptoms from alcohol.
So you're talking about detoxing.
I'm talking about detoxing. Now, detoxing for the longest period of time was what we used from previously used withdrawal recovery of substances. But now we actually use these three methods we just talked about: the clinical method, the non-clinical method, and also the self-management. So we know that all three of these work, but how effective these particular programs work has to do with the individual, has to do with the drugs and the substance they're addicted to, or the behavior they're addicted to, and also has to do with how long they actually have been addicted to the substance, and actually what damage, what's physiological or biological damage has actually been done both to the brain, central nervous system, as well as the body.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Did you want to summarize what you've said?
Oh, well, in summary, we also talked about this before. Some of the things we say to people matter. Words do matter. And so when we're assisting an individual and family member, we know that recovery is really not an individual project. It's a family matter. In fact, I would go further and say it's not just a family matter, it's a community matter. Because more than one individual, even more sometimes more than the members of the immediate family, have to get involved in that person's recovery. And so they need assistance from family members. A good, strong support system is extremely important. They need to become knowledgeable about the pathways of recovery. We just talked about some of those, the clinical pathways and non-clinical pathways, self-management, and recovery from a substance or behavior disorder. It's been defined as a process of improved physical, psychological, and social well-being and health after having suffered from a substance-related condition. And once again, how long they've been in that situation makes a difference. The brain is capable of recovering from opioid misuse by the process of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the process by which we learn. It's also the process by which we develop habits, good or bad. It's also the process by which we can unlearn and reverse the development of those same habits. It's possible to retrain the brain. It's very, very possible to retrain the brain. It actually will take time. That's an individual process, and it's a process that we have to take in consideration when we're trying to develop, when a person or persons select the pathway of recovery. It should be done on an individual basis. Each person should be evaluated or have themselves evaluated and decide what's the best pathway for them. For some, it may be the clinical pathway. Others, it may be self-management. Some may take the non-clinical pathway, and because it works best for them. Cost has to be considered, and a number of the factors as well have to be considered.
Thank